Hey everyone, hope you've been well, and welcome back to the Mental Game Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Brief, and I'm going to try a little something new this week because I fear that sometimes I sit here in the home studio in Chicago and go on and on and on about all things and the guest, and next thing you know, 5 minutes go by and you're waiting for the guest. So let's cut right to the chase. Julie Kliegman is the author of one of my favorite books of the year. It's called Mind Game, an inside look at the mental health playbook of elite athletes. And if you have listened to even a second of The Mental Game, you know why I love this book, and you know why I want you to read it. So let's hear from the author. Julie Kliegman is the next guest on The Mental Game in 3, 2, 1. And a delight to welcome back to The Mental Game writer and the author of one of my favorite books of the year, Mind Game, an inside look at the mental health playbook of elite athletes. A good friend of the program, Julie Kliegman. Welcome back, Julie.
Hi, it's so nice to be back. Thank you for having me.
You've been up to quite a bit. Last time I talked to you, you were getting into the process, feet wet in the book writing process, and now you've got this hardcover beauty that's been on the shelves for over a year now. So what's it been like, the release of the book and the reception of the book?
Oh man, it's been a journey for sure. Having it out there feels so good. I don't think that'll get old. And yeah, just the reception has been great. Like I hope it's meant a lot to a lot of people, whether they're athletes or not. But yeah, the feedback I hear has been pretty positive. So it's been great.
It's positive from here too. And I'll have links in the description of the podcast, so any interested listeners who haven't read it yet can go ahead and buy it and get their paws on it. But let's break it down a little, Julie. I want to hear about your inspiration for writing the book. You had written in your time at Sports Illustrated and some other places about some buzzy topics within the mental health world in sports, and then you wake up and decide to write this whole dang book, which is a huge undertaking. So why?
I was kind of realizing that it's hard to even scratch hit the tip of the iceberg really with just a story here or there for a magazine or a website. There's really just so much to dive into. And when I started at Sports Illustrated was just before the pandemic started. And when the pandemic started and I wrote the article for Sports Illustrated about how athletes are affected mental health wise by COVID-19, not even just by having it, but by having to run their lives around it in the absence of sports. I realized that look, none of this is going away. Like mental health and athletes, we're going to be talking about that, I hope at least, for a very long time. And there's just so much to tackle about it.
It's kind of daunting, right? It's just such a big topic. It's an important topic. It touches people of all ages. It's sort of intimidating to cover for me. Right. I would imagine for you the same, no?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's just so much to do. I imagine the book could have been 5 times as long if I'd had more time. But, a friend was talking to me about it this way once. He was kind of just well, this is the first book that's pretty squarely on this topic for a lay audience. So there's room to do other stuff, either for me to do other stuff or for, other authors to kind of contribute their own books to this field. There's just so much out there that can be written about it. And, it was a challenge squeezing it all into, I don't know, however long it is, however many pages. I feel like I should know that, but I don't.
Well, it flew by. Let's see. Yeah, I got 232 here.
Okay, yeah. So squeezing it all into 232, that's not easy, but it means there's so much left to delve into.
There is, and I know you have another book already in the works. It's not Mind Game 2.0. It's a totally different topic. We'll get to that at the end. It's just a teaser for now. We'll take it one book at a time, as you've done in your writing process. But Julie, I'm curious about this because I started The Mental Game in 2020, also kind of right as the pandemic was getting underway. And a big reason why I started it was not just what I was observing in the sports world, but what I was observing in myself. I was coming to terms with my own mental health issues. They were getting worse, sort of inflamed by the pandemic in a lot of ways. And I'm not so sure I would have started this podcast if I didn't have my own mental health journey. I read in the beginning of Mind Game that played a role for you as well. So how important was your own journey in deciding to write about this?
Oh, it was so crucial. Like the reason I write about mental health at all, I mean, maybe I would have eventually found another way into it, but the reason I started caring and paying attention to it is because I started dealing with like symptoms of mental illness when I was in high school. I mean, and in hindsight, probably even earlier. Yeah, I eventually probably like 6 years ago now, I got diagnosed with bipolar 2. But for a while I thought it was just depression. And yeah, it's just that experience has been everything for me. People say write about what you know. I know mental health. I played sports growing up, so to a much lesser extent, I know sports and I've watched sports and I've talked to many, many athletes now. So writing about mental health in sports, yeah, it made sense to me.
You can relate, right? And I know in interviewing athletes who struggle with their own mental health, I've sometimes found that empathy to be helpful. Like, hey, dude, me too. I also experienced these things. I'm sure in your hours of interviews, you had moments like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think it really helps to be able to talk to someone who like doesn't see you as like an alien or something for having these issues.
On the note of being able to relate and doing those interviews, I mean, you did hours, probably days worth of interviews with some of the best athletes in the world, with NBA players, with Olympians, with Grand Slam winners. A year later, and more than a year later from a lot of those interviews, what's one that still crosses your mind a lot?
Okay, yes. The one that really gets me is McKayla Maroney. We talked for probably like an hour at least. And for those who may not be familiar, she was the gymnast, the US Olympic gymnast. She made the not impressed face that went viral after she got a silver medal. And I think she was like such a part of like a very specific part of our culture at a very specific time. And she's just dealt with so much between she says she was a victim of Larry Nassar's abuse, as so many US gymnasts unfortunately were. And she's dealt with her own mental health struggles, as a result of that, concurrent with that. But yeah, talking to her about like what it's like to become a meme essentially was so interesting to me. It's not a conversation you have every day.
What's something she told you that really struck you?
Oh, good question. It really was. I just think like the impact that like abuse at such a young age, at such a formative age, like your early teenage years can have on you. Like, I mean, that's really stuck with her, and her experience has really stuck with me. So
incredible in the book to read about her, to read about so many of these athletes, and they all blend together to create this narrative that almost by the end feels like a call to action. I almost feel like I want to help, right? And I know that's what a lot of readers would take away from this. And Julie, you do a wonderful job in the end at outlining some conclusions. Like, all right, all that. What do we do going forward? So when listeners to this podcast read the book, which I hope they do, what do you want them to take away?
That's a great question. And I love that it felt like a call to action to you, because that's how I wanted it to feel. Like I want people to feel empowered to, make this world slightly better for athletes and non-athletes among us who deal with mental illness. I think, there are some takeaways for us as like media practitioners, like you and I specifically, but there are also some things that like everyone can do, which is just like, I hope people see athletes in a more, I guess, realistic light, see them as full people, people who can struggle with things, but still excel, in their jobs and in other ways. I hope that, when readers of this book, who have kids, either presently or will in the future, I hope that they consider the elements of the book when they are getting their kids into sports.
Yeah, I know when my future children, if they're doing sports, if they want an off day, like, yeah, I'll give them an off day. I think
Yeah.
they need some mental rest. On that note, that's a key part of one of the parts I want to dive in on is towards the
Hmm.
end, you reference a conversation you had with a former ice hockey and rugby player at Dartmouth by the name of Mac Morse. And Mac
Hmm.
talks about how athletes maybe need to take a breather more, maybe need to relax more, and
Right.
quotes the intensity of being alive. Now, when you talk about things that everyone can relate to, I would imagine any worker of any job, any parent, any human being at some time has felt that life is just too intense. What do you want readers to take from that?
Yeah, I think like I would like them to understand that, like, yeah, not every job or not every situation in life is a situation where you can kind of like take a moment to take a step back and breathe. But then again, most situations are that. Like, not everything is an emergency. So I'd really like for people to sort of internalize that idea that most things, unless you're like literally working in an ER and you're on shift or something, most things are not life and death. You can step away, you can take that break, you can take some time to just breathe and think about what is it that I want to do, what is it that I need to accomplish, what can wait, where do I want to go from here?
So many people now say that, right? You're
Mhm.
saying it. I've said it many times. I've seen others on TV and in the media say it. Like, oh, yeah, you should be able to take a break, right? Mental health is
Right.
health, rah, rah, rah. And then when a
Mhm.
Naomi Osaka steps aside or a Ben Simmons goes through what he went through with taking
Mhm.
a break, there's this vitriol, right? This backlash. And it
Yeah.
feels like billions of people are piling on these athletes as babies and quitters and everything in between. So where's that disconnect coming from?
I mean, that's such a good point. We really have to like embody what we're saying and take that extra step of like accepting people who come forward. And I think it goes back to what I was saying about how we perceive athletes. And we have just such different expectations for them than we have for like our friends or family. We see them as being so mentally tough that like for them taking a break ends up seeming like cowardly or even like offensive somehow. But that's wild to me. Like we really need to like say like, okay, as a fan, as a viewer, as a member of the media especially, like, okay, they're doing a job and they're allowed breaks from it. And I think we just need to really put that together. Like, how would you want your friend or family member to be treated if they were in that situation?
Right. You can't go on and say, yeah, we got to have work life balance and respect these people, and then say, oh, he's soft. He
Yeah,
quit. Right? Like, you can't have it both ways. And I think
exactly.
that's something I really learned in Mind Game is it's more than just the basic. It's more than just, hey, let's respect these people. It's like, let's change the culture a little bit. And it
Hmm.
really starts with the way we speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like maybe this is what you're driving at, but there's so many terms and like uh different concepts around mental health in sports and sports psychology that like it can be tough to even speak the same language and know what we're talking about, let alone like you said, working to change the culture around it.
I want to play with that a little bit, Julie, because that was one of the most interesting parts of this for me. It was towards the beginning of the book, and you mention how the terms mental health and mental illness are just kind of tossed around,
Yeah.
sometimes with no delineation between those two, and they are two very different things. And usually when we read about it, it's mental health. Sometimes we see illness, sickness, sometimes like all this stuff. So I'm curious what you learned about the lingo and the decisions you used in writing this behind some of those terms.
Yeah, it was kind of tough to sort out even for myself, and then let alone to go forward and articulate that to the reader. But mental health, I think, like you said, is kind of often tossed around. Like it's they're words with meaning, but I think the way we use them as like a euphemism for mental illness or we use them when we mean a concept like sports psychology or something. It can just start to sound like mental health means nothing, even though we know that's not true. Everybody has mental health, not everybody has mental illness, so the terms are not interchangeable. But I think it can sound like a series of buzzwords, basically. And then you haven't even gotten to the point that there's like some people prefer to call this madness, like many psych patients, especially, have been part of a movement for many years now where they don't like the term mentally ill. They prefer the term mad. So that was a decision I had to make too, was I ended up acknowledging it as, hey, this is a preference. Like I can't accommodate every person's preferred terminology throughout the book. Unfortunately, I wish it were easier to do, but I figured I at least had to acknowledge that, hey, not everyone agrees about what to call this.
And I appreciated that as a reader. You were like, hey, here's all the history, here's all the terms, here's all the options on the table. I'm going with this, just so you know. Mm-hmm. And you did, and stayed consistent with it. It's so fascinating how many different things, aspects of life, people refer to as mental health. I mean, in the media, I have seen everything from, Julie Kliegman is meditating before a game, thus embracing mental health, to,
right.
So-and-so is checked into the hospital with a suicide attempt, and that's struggling with their mental health. Like, how does that buzz phrase encompass both of those things? Because the meditation and the hospital visit, those are two pretty different things.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the first category I think that you're speaking to is really like mental wellness or mindfulness, even to be more precise. And yeah, mental illness, is really not that you have to be hospitalized to be considered mentally ill, like far from it. But yeah, you're talking about two very different ends of the spectrum here.
Do you feel that term mental health is overused in media right now?
Yeah, I think if not yet, then we're definitely getting there. I think it's also like not just the media, but I think we have to start looking for organizations and even players who might not mean super well, that, they're like, say someone, and this has happened, I think, in the NBA, but a specific name is not coming to mind, but the situation is like, oh, if you're accused of violence or something like that, like especially like domestic violence or sexual violence of any sort, and you're like, well, I need to work on my mental health. It's like, okay, what are we saying here? Is that really the most accurate representation of what's going on?
Right. You're just saying you need to work on yourself. So go work on yourself.
Right.
Something in Mind Game, Julie, that I learned is some of the pioneers of this. I think a lot of sports fans have grown accustomed to, those same names that came out and spoke about mental health. And there's this perception that there was no one doing it at all, ever, until the DeMar, DeRozan, Kevin Love, Simone Biles, Naomi Osaka, all these people who we all know and love and have rooted for. But there are some people who most fans have never heard of, who much earlier were coming forward and saying that they were struggling and being very honest. So if you wouldn't mind spilling out a little bit of that, why did you feel it was so important to go back and set the table here?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about anything that's like an ongoing conversation, an ongoing dialogue, it's important to recognize the history of that movement and not just stay like hyper focused almost on the present moment or the future, but to actually say like, okay, how did we get here? What mistakes have various parties made? What went well? What can we collectively as a society do better going forward? And so I think there's a lot of value in looking at things like, what was Shamiqua Holdsclaw's experience in the WNBA dealing with, depression, suicidal ideation, later diagnosed with bipolar disorder. What was something like that like for her? What was the experience of these MLB players who were coming out as being mentally ill, kind of on the earlier side of things? What did they go through? How did the press treat them? How did the public treat them? And yeah, like all the way up to like Michael Phelps was talking about him as a pioneer is appropriate too. So it's like this very wide range of people's experiences that we don't want to forget about.
Something that ties all of those experiences together is the concept that they didn't necessarily want this, right? We sort of glorify these people. Oh, they came forward, so brave, so wonderful. They're helping so many people out there. But it means they're struggling. Like,
Right.
they didn't wake up and say like, oh, amazing, I get to be a mental health warrior, lucky me, right? Like it means
Right.
if you got depression or anxiety or you're really struggling, you don't necessarily want that. And when I read those words in your book, I was like, damn, yeah, like it's no fun to be a mental health warrior if you're struggling.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not really many people's first choice of like activism. I mean, it's kind of like this is not the same thing, but it's kind of like if you lose a parent and you become like some ambassador for like, young kids who have gone through like grief in life. It's like no one would ever choose that. Like you'd have to be nuts. So it really is about watching these athletes embrace parts of themselves that they'd rather not have to deal with at all, and kind of advocate from that lens. But it's not like anybody is like clamoring for this attention.
Right. There's no long line to be the next person to come forward and write a Players Tribune article about how they're struggling, right? That
Exactly.
struggle.
Right.
One of these that I think stood out a lot to me because of current events was the Mets pitcher, late 90s, a gentleman by the name of Pete Harnisch, who went in front of the media and he said, I would like to let everyone know that I've been diagnosed with depression. And he sat out for a bit, and the media reaction was interesting, to say the least. But he came forward and he said depression. It wasn't, I'm struggling with mental health. It wasn't, I'm stepping aside and not giving a reason. It was, I've been diagnosed with depression. Now, this reminded me of something that happened 3 months ago. A Red Sox pitcher by the name of Chris Martin went on the 15-day injured list, and the Red Sox tweeted that he was on the injured list, and in parentheses, they put anxiety. A very interesting media and social media reaction to that. Was it too much? Was it too specific? A whole debate ensued. So do you see the connection I'm seeing between those two?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of power in like putting a name to what you're going through, both for yourself and for others who may be experiencing something similar. I would hope and imagine that the Red Sox cleared that with a player. But yeah, I think like there's also like a Players Tribune essay about this from Liz Cambage. Like the title is like did not play dash mental health. And it's the essay is kind of about like how she wishes that had been like in the box score instead of like did not play whatever the actual entry was. And I think as long as everyone is comfortable, the person going through the experience is comfortable with the label being applied, I think there's so much power in just being able to say what it actually is.
Right. It can and should be up to the player, right? Like maybe I would want to use the term anxiety. That Sam Brief,
Right.
personally, that's what I deal with. If I take an off day, that probably might be what it is. But maybe I would rather it go on as personal reasons or
Right.
mental health. I don't know. But Chris Martin wanted anxiety. Pete Harnisch wanted to go in front of the media and say, I've been diagnosed with depression. Player's choice, that rules to me.
I just read an article for Outside about how we shouldn't pressure players to provide those details, which I think is hugely important. But it doesn't sound like that's what was happening here. It doesn't sound like that's what happened with Pete Harnisch. So as long as this is of the player's own volition and not something that fans or the media feel like they're owed from a player, I think, it's all a good thing.
Those names you mentioned, Pete Harnisch, even Michael Phelps to an extent, Royce White, Shamike Holdsclaw, those, to draw a comparison to sort of a product or a fad catching on, like those are sort of the early adopters. And then you outline the floodgates opening with the NBA players. DeMar DeRozan and Kevin Love specifically, and then it really hits this turbo boost with the Olympic stage in Simone Biles and the major tennis stage in Naomi Osaka.
Yeah.
When do you feel like this took hold of the world's attention the most?
I feel like more than anything, it was people paying attention to Simone Biles. I mean, she's one of the most, not just one of the most famous athletes in the world, but like Michael Phelps, she's one of the most famous people in the world, probably. I mean, just the level of fame there is hard to match. And the stage of the Olympics is really hard to match as well. Like, not to take anything away from like Naomi Osaka, but like it's one thing to be in a tennis major and another thing to be in like the major of like every single sport at once. And you know, it's such a big political event in addition to just being a sporting event. And I think I mean, there wasn't a single person who didn't seem to have a take about Simone Biles, good or bad, like whatever their opinion was, like they were sure sharing it during those Olympics.
When Simone went through what she went through at those Tokyo Olympics, that was before you wrote Mind Game. Now looking at it later, after writing this book and also after seeing how she came back and won some more gold at the Paris Olympics, how do you look at Simone Biles differently, if you do at all?
Yeah, I think part of it is I have not that I didn't have a deep respect for her before, but it's, you know, it's grown even deeper, just based on how she spoke up for herself and at those Tokyo games and did what she needed to do to keep her body and mind safe. And then, yeah, to have the fortitude to come back and try all over again, especially at an age that, while still very young, is like frowned upon to do professional gymnastics, or not professional, but elite gymnastics at that age. So I really, if anything, I mean, I have all the respect in the world for her, and my opinion didn't so much as change, but like the level of impressive it is like definitely grew for me.
So hyper impressive. I mean, I'm always like jaw drop on the floor impressed watching Simone Biles, because I don't understand how the human body can move like that, and the air she gets under her. I mean, it's wild. That's separate, though. What she's battled personally, the respect is so deep for me. And Julie, I love what you wrote in the New York Times right after some of Simone's performances at the Olympics. You said that Simone confirmed a truth that psychology studies have long revealed, and that's that elite athletes face many of the same mental health challenges as the rest of society. They just play out on a grander, more public stage. There's no stage more grand, more public than the Olympics. So I can watch Simone and say, I can't flip like that, but I can persevere like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Julie, I'm sort of backtracking in time here, but I thought one of the most powerful conversations it seemed you had was with Kevin Love. And he was so open about what he went through and what sort of respect he holds for DeMar DeRozan, who he's associated with in the NBA in a lot of ways. What's something you learned from Kevin?
Man, just the power that, I don't know if I learned this from him, but he certainly underscored that there's a lot of power to be had in speaking up and, you know, just reclaiming for yourself this like part of your identity that you thought was shameful. I mean, he had this panic attack and no one knew about it outside his very close circle for a long time. And then to be able to share that on the internet is like, you know, it could have gone so much differently. It could have gone poorly for him, but he really embraced it, and now he's an advocate for mental health. And it's like what we were saying before, it's not what you want to be necessarily, but he's doing a damn good job of it.
He really is. And it struck me that was super important, that moment. Him, DeMar DeRozan, the NBA, because the NBA, it's a players' league, and so many young boys and girls see them as like these godlike, huge figures, right? They're all like 7, 8, 9 feet tall or whatever.
Yeah.
And that humanized them in a very important way, right? So different than Simone Biles, maybe. Certainly they're a lot taller than Simone Biles. But a few years earlier, I know as a young person, that struck me as a vital moment.
Part of it was the power of Kevin and DeMar coming forward in such quick succession, with DeMar coming first by a handful of days, maybe. That really kind of hit home the concept for people that athletes do struggle. NBA players in this progressive league, like you were suggesting, like they do struggle. Despite their success, despite their wealth, there is this issue. And I think that two stories, were more than the sum of their parts.
And Kevin Love tells you in the book, there is no magic bullet for this. It takes work, just like it takes work for an individual like me, maybe like you, to work on your mental health. And from a societal perspective, there's no magic bullet. So Mind Game does not give you a magic bullet. It gives you the history, it gives you the story, it gives you perspectives, and it gives you a lot to think about. Julia, I could talk about this book all day and go line by line and paragraph by paragraph, but then we'd be doing the whole damn book, and I kind of want at least someone to pick it up and read it. So
Yes.
Info is in the description. Pick up Mind Game. Anything you want to leave us with on Mind Game before I dive a little bit into your next project?
Oh man. I don't know if there's one specific thing I hope people take away, but do buy the book or rent the book from your local library. I just want to be clear that authors love that too.
So many ways to get books these days. Make sure you take advantage of all of them. I want to say, just on a personal note, I also am working on my first book, a little different than Mind Game, a fiction novel, also about sports and mental health. Julie has been really helpful to me behind the scenes, just helping me get through the rainforest that is writing a book and trying to get it published. So, Julie, I want to say thank you for that. You are a true expert in the field now with some actual paperweight behind you.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad I've been helpful to you. And, I can't wait for your book. I'm so psyched for that.
Thanks, Julie. But first, I can't wait for your next book. We got a 2026 release for Finding Renee. So I'll leave it to you however you want to lay it out. Tease me on Finding Renee.
Sure. So it is a biography coming from HarperCollins about Renee Richards, who, depending on the age of your listeners, may or may not, that name may or may not ring a bell. She is a transgender woman who played tennis in the 70s. As a woman, but she had to sue for that right to play in the US Open in 1977. So, she had been a successful tennis player while presenting as a man in the first part of her life. And yeah, she transitions and says, hey, I still feel like I should be able to play tennis at a high level. And so the story is about her. It's about my journey to learning her story. It's about trans athletes and the kind of debate surrounding them even today, almost 50 years after Renee's lawsuit.
Sometimes the best way to learn about something happening in the world right now is to go back in time, right? And to see the history of it, see maybe how this happened 50 years ago. So along those lines, why this topic? Why now?
Yeah, I mean, I would love for trans participation in sports to be kind of like a settled science and a settled sociological concept, but the reality is it's just not. And also, Renee is still with us today. She's 90. She turned 90 a few weeks ago. And what better time to hear her story while we can still hear it from her and I can still write it down. She's participating in interviews for the book. And I just think like she's someone who was one of the most talked about people in the country at the time. But again, that was almost 50 years ago. And I just don't want her story to be lost to time.
And I know you're already doing the legwork and the research that goes into making sure her story is never lost. Mm-hmm. Would you mind letting us in a little behind the scenes? Because I know you've been crisscrossing the country and going to all sorts of strange places and hidden dungeons around America to learn about Renee.
Sure, let's say that. Yeah. No, so I've been doing a lot of in-person and phone interviews with everyone in her life and a lot of experts on the topic of trans participation in sports. But I also, I think what you're referencing, it wasn't quite a dungeon, but I did make it to North Carolina to do some research at the Duke Archives, which happens to hold like a treasure trove of resources about Renee from the 70s. The writer Eleanor Dienstag was going to write an autobiography with Renee, of Renee, and that didn't pan out, but she had a lot of transcripts with Renee's friends, some of whom have since passed, with one of Renee's doctors at the time, who helped oversee her transition from a medical perspective. So there's like all this stuff in the archives that I'm just kind of like gobbling up, right? Like I'm just so excited to share that with readers.
So it's not a dungeon.
You know, it's not, it's probably about as well lit as a dungeon is, like the Duke Archives reading room. It's not and they'll acknowledge that when they have like lights at every table because the overhead light is just not sufficient. But it is a really beautiful space if anybody's in North Carolina.
I do love North Carolina, so I might have to check that out. The barbecue's good. The people are nice. Julie, in case anyone's interested in this type of thing, just thinking about writing and being an author, I do want to ask you this. I know you like me, have a background in journalism, at Medill School of Journalism, Northwestern. Go Cats. We got to get that out there, of course. Can't have two Northwestern alums on a podcast without a good old Go Cats. But
right,
your background, journalism, you worked at The Ringer, Sports Illustrated, some other places, but now you're an author. Like, you're doing these huge mammoth projects and going to these archives. It's a way different than the day-to-day life of being a journalist or sports journalist. So what's that life like? How are we liking it?
Oh, I mean, I love it. I think it's important to still find ways to like fund that life. But so, you'll still catch me taking on freelance projects. I also have a part-time job with Apple News. So, copy editing for them. I love copy editing. But yeah, I think it's so nice and such a privilege to be able to dive so deeply into something you're obsessed with and can't stop thinking about. And that's been the case for both of my books. So I love it. No complaints here. Well, I mean, definitely some complaints about like how hard it is to write a book, but not too many complaints.
If it was easy, it wouldn't be worth doing it. And you're doing it at such an insanely high level for someone who had not, prior to Mind Game, written a book like this. So, I mean, bravo. You're an inspiration to me, and I hope an inspiration to a few other people listening to this podcast. The great Julie Kliegman, author of Mind Games, soon to be author of Finding Renee. Julie, thanks for coming back on the pod.
Thank you so much, Sam. It was a delight.
Now go be safe in the dungeons out there, all right?
Will do.
And back here in the studio, great to chat with fellow Northwestern Wildcat and fellow Cute Cat owner, Julie Kliegman. This book's really good. I'm serious. I wouldn't have someone on the podcast promoting a book if I didn't think it was worth your time. So check out the links in the description. Julie's not paying me, I promise. I actually just think this is a gem and think it's really well done, well researched, and if you want, you should read it. If not, hope you enjoyed the interview. Either way, hope you're doing well and enjoying these last few editions of the Mental Game podcast. If you missed our first post-Olympic edition, it was with Chad McGeehee, the first ever director of meditation training at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. A lot of great insight into what even you and I could do to boost our performance through meditation, and we got tons more in the archive, so feel free to take a look at that. As always, you're liking, you're subscribing. It helps a great deal. And finally, I'd like to remind you that this podcast is in part brought to you by the Lasers Ladybug Society, a phenomenal institution founded by friends of the pod, John and Renee Laser, doing all sorts of great things in getting funds together in the Virginia DMV area for mental health in schools and other facilities. You can check them out at the link in the description of this episode. But for now, I've been Sam Brief. That has been Julie Kliegman, and this is the Mental Game Podcast. Take care of yourself, take care of others, and I will talk to you next time. Adios.